The certified letter shook in Karen's perfectly manicured hands as she stood rigid on her porch. $3 million. The number stared back at her like a taunt carved into the legal document. Every zero felt like a spotlight exposing her spectacular downfall. Her usually flawless composure fractured like brittle ice. And for the first time in her entire reign as HOA president, Karen Peaton looked genuinely afraid. Let me rewind 6 months back when life on my 30-acre ranch was still calm and quiet. My name is David, and I've owned Cedar Ridge Ranch for 15 years. The centerpiece of my land was a gorgeous 12-acre private lake, stocked full of bass and surrounded by weeping willows. It was my personal paradise, until Karen moved into our rural community and somehow wormed her way into the HOA presidency. Karen was the kind of person who wore power suits to backyard barbecues and carried a clipboard everywhere like it was royal regalia. Within weeks of taking office, she started stirring things up. First came new rules about what colors fences could be painted, then came regulations controlling livestock noise. But the moment she set her sights on my lake, that's when things really got interesting. It began subtly. One Saturday morning, Karen showed up with her fiancé, Brad, a real estate developer who drove a chrome-wrapped Tesla. With a syrupy smile, she announced that the HOA board wanted to discuss community lake access. I calmly reminded her that the lake was private property, not community-owned. Her smile tightened like a violin string ready to snap. The very next week, I found Karen hosting an HOA meeting at my lake pavilion, the one I personally built for family gatherings. About 20 people sat there while she gestured toward my water as if she held the deed. When I confronted her, she claimed the pavilion sat on the property line, making it fair game. It wasn't, and my survey proved it, but Karen just smirked and said we would discuss it at the next board meeting. Things spiraled after that. One morning, I woke to the sound of hammering and found contractors building a floating dock. Karen stood in the middle of it all, directing them on where her fiancé wanted his jet ski station. When I demanded they stop, she whipped out a manila folder and waved paperwork at me, claiming the HOA had authority over all water features within the community. I called the sheriff immediately, but Karen had already played her hand. While I'd been out of town, she'd filed an emergency HOA resolution declaring my lake community property under something she called the Common Area Precedent Clause. Total nonsense, but enough to stall things while lawyers sorted it out. Meanwhile, contractors kept flooding in. First, a boathouse, then a beach with truckloads of imported sand. Karen even installed a gate with a combination lock, giving the code only to her inner circle. When neighbors asked to fish, she told them the lake was under renovation for safety, all while Brad threw massive parties every weekend. The thump of his speakers echoed across what used to be my peaceful water. The breaking point came one night during one of Brad's gatherings. 50 people lounged on my land, none with my permission. Karen stood on my dock, wearing a white sundress, champagne flute in hand, looking like she'd just conquered the world. When I told her everyone needed to leave, she laughed, a high, tinkling sound that made my jaw tighten. She loudly announced that I was a bitter old loner trying to hoard community amenities. Then Brad strutted forward, all 6 feet of spray tan ego, and laid a hand on my shoulder. He told me I needed to learn to share, that Karen had gifted him lake usage rights as an engagement present, and maybe I should consider relocating somewhere more fitting for hermits. People laughed nervously, unsure who they were supposed to side with. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my desk digging through property records, HOA bylaws, and county files, and what I found nearly stopped my heart. Karen hadn't just filed a resolution, she had submitted a fraudulent easement to the county clerk, forging my signature and claiming I had agreed to hand over lake rights to the HOA in exchange for reduced dues. The notary stamp was fake. The witness signatures were fabricated. It was criminal. The next morning, I was standing outside my lawyer's office before sunrise. Janet Morrison, 30 years in property law, took one look at the paperwork and let out a low whistle. "This isn't HOA overreach," she said. "This is felony-level fraud. We spent the entire day assembling evidence and preparing for war. The cease and desist letter was hand-delivered to Karen right in the middle of an HOA meeting. I'll never forget how the color drained from her face as she read it. She tried to act composed, insisting it was a misunderstanding, but her trembling voice betrayed her. Even Brad's cocky grin softened into worry. Karen's next move was pure panic. She sent me a letter on official HOA letterhead claiming that any legal action against board members would result in special assessments for all homeowners to cover defense costs. It was a threat meant to turn neighbors against me instead. It backfired spectacularly. People started asking why she needed defense funds for what she kept calling a simple dispute, when Karen ignored the cease and desist. Janet filed the lawsuit, $3 million, for property damage, trespassing, fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and punitive damages. The complaint was 60 pages long, packed with photos, timestamps, construction invoices, and copies of the forged documents. Karen was served at her engagement party. The process server told me she laughed at first, thinking it was some kind of prank. But when she saw the amount, she dropped her champagne glass. It shattered on the marble patio, ringing out like the bell, signaling the end of her empire. Her attorney, a bargain bin traffic ticket lawyer, was completely outmatched. At the first hearing, he tried to argue that HOA presidents had broad authority to interpret community needs. Judge Harold Brennan was not impressed. He'd reviewed the forged documents and asked Karen point blank if she had filed them. She tried to dodge the question, insisting she had acted in good faith based on her interpretation of HOA guidelines. The trial was fast and merciless. Janet delivered evidence like a maestro conducting a symphony of devastation. Survey maps proved beyond doubt that the lake sat entirely on my land. Bank statements revealed Karen had used HOA funds to pay contractors. The forged documents were reviewed by a handwriting expert who confirmed every signature was fake. Karen's worst moment arrived when Brad took the stand. Under oath, he admitted Karen had promised him the lake as an engagement gift and that he'd already begun marketing it to potential clients for his development company. He tossed her under the bus without hesitation, claiming he'd been misled about the property's legal status. When Karen herself took the stand, she tried to spin a story about community enhancement and shared resources. She called me selfish, insisted the lake was neglected and underused. But the moment Janet questioned her about the forged signatures, Karen unraveled. She stuttered, contradicted herself, and finally claimed she didn't recall the documents at all. Judge Brennan's ruling hit like a hammer. He found her liable on every count, awarded me the full $3 million in damages, and referred the forgery case to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. He also issued a permanent injunction preventing Karen from ever setting foot on my land again, and ordered that every unauthorized structure be removed at her expense. The courtroom fell silent as he read the total. $3 million. Karen's knees buckled. She clutched the defendant's table to stay upright. Her perfectly styled hair seemed to collapse, and tears cut streaks through her designer makeup. When the judge asked if she understood the ruling, she could only nod, her voice gone. As the bailiff announced dismissal, Karen turned toward me. The towering confidence she once carried like armor was gone, replaced with the hollow stare of someone witnessing their life crumble. Brad was already striding out, phone pressed to his ear, likely calling his attorney about dissolving the engagement. The last thing I heard as I walked out was Karen whispering to her lawyer, asking how someone could lose everything over a lake, and his blunt reply that fraud tends to have consequences. 2 weeks later, the criminal charges landed. Karen was arrested at her home and charged with felony forgery, facing up to 5 years in prison and another $200,000 in fines. She stood in the doorway as officers read her rights, still wearing her HOA president blazer like it was armor that had long since failed her. The HOA held an emergency meeting that same evening. News of the arrest spread like wildfire. The recreation center was so packed that people lined the walls. Karen's vice president, Michael Torres, called the meeting to order with visible reluctance. He'd once been her strongest supporter. Now, he looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. The motion to remove Karen from the board passed swiftly and unanimously. Even her former inner circle voted against her, eager to distance themselves from the scandal. When the results were announced, someone in the back actually clapped before realizing the moment. The board voted to audit all HOA finances and reverse every decision Karen made involving my lake. Neighbors later told me, Karen showed up halfway through the meeting apparently out on bail. The security guard enforced the restraining order and turned her away. She stood in the parking lot yelling about conspiracies and jealous neighbors until her lawyer physically dragged her to the car. Several people filmed it, and the videos quickly went viral in our local groups. The next blow came from her employer. Karen had been a senior manager at a property management firm, a title she often flaunted to intimidate neighbors with her expert opinion. When the company learned about the fraud charges, it launched an internal review. They found she had used her work email to coordinate the lake seizure and even attempted to bill parts of the construction cost to her employer under community improvements. They fired her immediately. Her $70,000 salary vanished. Her benefits gone. The company also began reviewing every property she'd ever managed for similar misconduct. Her professional license was suspended pending trial, effectively ending her career. Brad's departure was vicious. He didn't just end the engagement, he sued her for the return of the ring and damages to his business reputation. His company had already printed marketing brochures advertising exclusive lake access. He no longer had. He claimed Karen's fraud cost him 3 major clients who now questioned his credibility. The demolition of the illegal structures was scheduled for a month later. Karen was responsible for the costs, but with her assets frozen and legal fees exploding, she took out a massive loan against her house. On demolition day, she sat in her car just outside the restraining order's boundary, watching the crews tear apart her dream dock and boat house piece by piece. When the foreman handed me the final invoice to forward to her attorney, the total was staggering, $97,000, between removal, restoration, and debris disposal. It was just one more blow, added to the $3 million judgment and her legal expenses. Karen's financial ruin soared past $4 million. The criminal trial was scheduled 6 months out. Karen's attorney filed delay tactic after delay tactic, but Judge Patricia Vega shut them all down. The prosecution, armed with everything from my evidence to the HOA's cleaned-up financial records, built a nearly unbreakable case. They discovered 12 instances of forged documents not just related to my lake, but other HOA matters Karen had manipulated. 3 days before Thetrial, I saw Karen at the grocery store. She was buying generic food, her designer wardrobe replaced by worn jeans and a faded sweatshirt. When our eyes met, she quickly looked away, but not before I saw the exhaustion carved into her expression. The woman who once strutted through the neighborhood like royalty now shuffled through the aisles like a ghost. Her house went up for sale that week, priced for a desperate, fast closing. The realtor sign looked almost mocking next to the HOA violation notice for her uncut lawn, a standard she once enforced ruthlessly. Neighbors told me she was living in her basement, renting out the upper floors to cover her legal debt. When her sentencing day arrived, the courtroom filled again. Karen stood before Judge Vega, her voice barely audible, as she pleaded guilty to avoid a harsher sentence. The judge sentenced her to 3 years in prison, with 2 years suspended, meaning she'd serve 1 year behind bars, followed by 5 years of probation, plus $200,000 in fines. The bailiff stepped toward her with handcuffs. Karen's legs gave out entirely. She sobbed, begging the judge for house arrest, insisting she'd lose everything if she went to prison. Judge Vega's reply was frost cold. She reminded Karen that she'd already lost everything through her own choices, and that fraud has consequences. The last thing I saw was Karen being led away in handcuffs.